Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I want to start us today with a question. On the screen at the moment is a picture of a plant showing that oxygen is being released from the leaves, carbon dioxide is taken into the leaves, and water and minerals are taken up by the roots. The question is, which of these processes is the odd one out? Pause this video now and press play when you're ready to go over the answer. So in previous lessons, we've learned that oxygen and carbon dioxide move by a process called diffusion. They move from an area where the particle's in a higher concentration to an area where it's in a lower concentration. At the same time, we've learned that water moves by a process called osmosis. And osmosis is the movement of water particles from a more dilute solution to a more concentrated solution. Whereas minerals do not move by either of these two processes. Minerals move by something called active transport, and that is today's lesson. So in your exercise books, as you would do for any other lesson, can you write the title, Active Transport? By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe what active transport is. You should be able to give examples of how active transport is used by living organisms, and you should be able to evaluate how active transport is different to diffusion and osmosis. So the first thing we need to say is, just to refresh our memory from previous lessons, is that diffusion and osmosis, so diffusion and osmosis are the movement of particles down a concentration gradient. Down a concentration gradient. So we've said in previous lessons that diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low. Osmosis is the movement of water particles from a dilute solution where there's more water particles to a concentrated solution where there are less water particles relative to the solvents it has. And we can also say that they are also passive. So we can say that, and I'm going to put this in red because it's important, they are said to be passive. P-A-S-S-I-V-E. Now in biology, if we say something is passive, remember all keywords are in green. If we say something is passive, P-A-S-S-I-V, it means that it does not require energy. Does not require energy. Okay? Now, sometimes cells need to absorb things from their surroundings that are found in low concentrations, and therefore diffusion will not work. So I'm going to put in this blue colour that cells sometimes need to absorb particles from their surroundings that are in low concentrations. Okay? Now, if substances are in low concentrations, diffusion will not work. So I'm going to put in red because it's important. In these cases, diffusion will not work. So an easy way to illustrate this, and I'm going to take an image from my lesson notes that I've obviously drawn, you can tell, because it's amazing. We're going to think about the root hair cell. Now, root hair cells are something we looked at when we looked at specialized cells, and they have a job to absorb minerals such as nitrates from the soil. Okay? So we can say that root hair cells absorb nutrients such as nitrates from the soil for plants to use. And we can put in red now because it's an important point for you to understand. But in the soil, there is a lower concentration of these nutrients than there is inside the root hair cell. So we can put, but the concentration of nutrients in the soil is much lower than their concentration within the cell. So what we've said here is that root hair cells need to absorb nutrients from the soil for plants to use. But the concentration of these nutrients is much lower in the surrounding soil than it is inside of the root hair cell. So what we're saying is that our concentration is high inside the cell and it is low outside the cell. Okay? What that means is if the plant relied on diffusion, the nutrients would move out of the cell. They would move from an area of high concentration to an area of low. So if the plant was relying on diffusion to do this, it wouldn't work because the substances in diffusion move in a passive process from an area of high concentration to an area of low. So they would move out of the cell. So we can say over here, and we can continue printing regs, it's important, that if the plant relied on diffusion, comma, particles would move out of the plant. Okay? So luckily, the plant doesn't rely on a process called diffusion. It relies on a different process called active transport. Active transport. Now, active transport can be defined as the movement of particles from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration or higher concentration to an area of higher concentration with use of energy. And I'm going to put that in red. With the use of energy. Okay? So, how something in biology is passive, it doesn't require energy. If something is active, it does require energy. Okay? Now, because active transport is the movement of particles from an area of low concentration to an area of high, the root hair cell can absorb particles via active transport from the soil into the root hair cell. So it is active transport that allows this. Okay? So we can just write underneath at the bottom, as a final bit on this slide, we can say that root hair cells absorb nutrients from the soil by active transport. Okay? So we've said that diffusion and osmosis are the movement of particles down a concentration gradient. They are said to be passive. Passive means that they do not require energy. Cells sometimes need to absorb particles from their surroundings that are in low concentrations, and in these cases diffusion won't work. For example, root hair cells absorb nutrients such as nitrates from the soil for plants to use. But the concentration of nutrients in the soil is much lower than their concentration within the cell. If the plant relied on diffusion, the particles would move out of the plant, because diffusion is the movement of particles from high to low. Therefore, diffusion would move in this way. Active transport is the movement of particles from an area of low concentration to an area of higher concentration with the use of energy. So the root hair cell can absorb the nutrients the plant needs from the soil with the use of energy via active transport. So, let's go over our final couple of things. One key thing that we need to point out now, we need to say that respiration releases energy in glucose so that active transport can take place. Now, it is important that you use the word releases, okay? You cannot say that it makes energy. Remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, so it must release energy. So I'm going to put underneath here that energy cannot be made or destroyed. Therefore, you must say that energy is released by respiration. Okay? Now, another example of active transport taking place, and one that's a bit closer to home, is in your digestive system. Okay? In a couple of lessons' time, we're going to be looking at the digestive system, and you're going to see that you have something called your small intestine. So this is your small intestine. And then running next to your small intestine, we're going to talk about the fact that you've got blood vessels known as capillaries. Okay? So this is a capillary, which is a blood vessel. We'll talk more about that towards the end of the year. Now, the small intestine contains lots of nutrients that your body can absorb. So in a process called absorption, your body takes nutrients from the small intestine and places them into the blood. So we can say that the small intestine contains lots of nutrients, and I'm going to put it in that color so you know what they are. Lots of nutrients that are absorbed by the blood so that cells can use them. So that cells can use them. Now, the nutrients inside of your small intestine are in a low concentration, whereas in your blood, in your capillary, they are in a higher concentration. Now remember, active transport is the movement of particles from a low concentration to a high concentration. We want to move these nutrients from the small intestine into the blood via absorption. So these particles move. I'm going to put some particles here so that you can see that it's in a higher concentration. But these particles here move via a process of active transport. So we can say that active transport moves nutrients from a low concentration in the small intestine into the capillary. Capillary is 1p. Okay, so we're moving the particles from a low concentration to a high concentration via active transport. Now again, this requires energy from respiration. Okay, so we will define it. We're going to do a whole topic on respiration in year 11, sorry, in year 10 even. Respiration. Respiration can be defined as a chemical reaction that releases energy from glucose. Now remember, as we said at the top of the page, it can't make energy. Energy can't be made or destroyed. It simply releases the energy. Okay? In order for respiration to take place, plants and animals need oxygen. So oxygen is needed for respiration. And we can say, therefore, that if there is no oxygen, there will be no respiration. If there is no respiration, there will be no energy. And therefore, if there is no energy, there will be no active transport. Okay? So if there's no oxygen, there'll be no respiration, therefore no energy, therefore no active transport. So respiration releases energy in glucose so that active transport can take place. Energy can't be created or destroyed, so you must say that it releases energy. In the small intestine, food particles that you eat during your dinner are in low concentration in the small intestine. We want to move them into the blood capillary so that the cells of your body can get the substances they need. The concentration of nutrients in the blood capillary is in a high concentration. Therefore, active transport is needed to move the particles from the small intestine into the capillary. We've then defined respiration by saying it's a chemical reaction that releases energy from glucose. Oxygen is needed for a certain type of respiration. Therefore, a good rule of thumb to have is that if there is no oxygen, there will be no respiration, therefore no energy, therefore no active transport. So you should now be able to tell me what active transport is. You should be able to give examples of how active transport is used by living organisms, and you should be able to compare active transport to both diffusion and osmosis. If you have any questions, please contact me by the usual means. If not, I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.